My wife had gone to live with her mom to care for her, so I went to surprise her with our son. The front door was open, and what we heard changed everything. I stood frozen in the doorway of my mother-in-law's house. My 7-year-old son, Leo, pressed a tiny finger to his lips, his eyes wide with an emotion I couldn't quite place. But when I leaned forward to see what had him so rattled, I saw Chloe, my wife of 9 years, laughing in the living room with her mom, Sarah. Both of them holding wine glasses, both looking healthier than I'd seen either of them in months. And in that instant, I knew every single thing I believed about Chloe for the past 7 weeks was a complete, agonizing lie. Chloe had told me she needed to move into her mother's place to provide round-the-clock care. Sarah, her mom, had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, one of those diagnoses that means you're basically counting days, not years. I'd supported that decision completely, because that's what you do when your family is facing something so devastating. I'd taken over all the household responsibilities, dropped Leo off at school every morning, picked him up every afternoon, handled his homework and his bedtime routine, paid all the bills for both households, and even sent Chloe $8,000 over those 7 weeks to cover medical expenses and whatever else they needed. I trusted her completely. The way you trust someone you've built a life with, the way you trust the mother of your child. I never once questioned whether she was being honest with me, because why would anyone lie about something like cancer? The weird signs had started about 3 weeks in. Small things that didn't quite add up, but I'd pushed them to the back of my mind because I felt guilty even noticing. Chloe had been posting on social media almost daily, updates about her caregiving journey that got hundreds of likes and comments. Things like, Day 21 of caring for mom. Some days are harder than others, but we keep fighting, with photos of her sitting beside hospital equipment or holding Sarah's hand. People were responding with prayers and heart emojis, offers to bring food or help in any way they could. I'd scroll through these posts late at night after putting Leo to bed, feeling this strange disconnect between what I was seeing online and what I was hearing during our brief phone calls, which had become less and less frequent. She'd say she was exhausted, that Sarah had had a rough day, that the treatments were really taking a toll. But her voice didn't sound exhausted, and when I'd ask specific questions about what the doctors were saying or what the treatment plan looked like, she'd get vague and change the subject. Then there was the issue with the photos she was posting. I'm not some tech genius, but I do know that when you take a picture with your phone, it embeds metadata that includes the date and location. I'd noticed some photos she posted, claiming to be from the hospital, were actually taken at restaurants or shopping centers. But I convinced myself maybe she was just reposting old photos, or the metadata was wrong somehow. The thing that really started to crack my denial was her nails. Which sounds stupid, but stay with me on this. About a month into her caregiving stint, I'd video called her one evening and noticed she had this elaborate manicure. Long acrylic nails with intricate designs that probably cost at least $80. When I mentioned they looked nice, she'd gotten defensive, claiming they were from before she'd moved in with her mom, that she just hadn't had time to get them removed. I'd let it go. But then 2 weeks later, when I'd driven by her mom's house to drop off some groceries, I saw her getting out of a car and her nails were different, a completely new design, fresh, and obviously recent. When I brought it up later, she'd insisted I was mistaken, that I was probably just remembering them wrong. And the way she said it made me feel like I was being paranoid or controlling for even noticing. The DoorDash charges were another thing that had started to bother me. I had access to our joint credit card statements, and I could see she was ordering food almost daily. Charges like $147, $160, $120, amounts that seemed excessive for someone who was supposedly spending all her time caring for a dying woman who probably couldn't eat much of anything. When I'd asked her about it, she'd explained the food was for both of them and sometimes for other family members who'd stopped by to visit. That had seemed plausible enough, so I dropped it. But it had added to this growing pile of small inconsistencies I couldn't quite ignore anymore. The surprise visit hadn't been planned as some kind of test or investigation. I genuinely just wanted to do something nice for her, because I knew how hard caregiving could be. So, I'd packed up Leo after school on a Friday afternoon and driven the 40 minutes to Sarah's house with the idea that we'd take Chloe out to dinner, or at least give her a break for a few hours. The front door had been slightly open, not wide open, but cracked enough that I could hear voices inside. When Leo peeked through the gap, he went completely still, then turned to me with a look I'd never seen on his face before, whispering that I should look but stay quiet. I bent down to see through the crack, and that's when I saw them sitting on the couch together. Chloe and Sarah, both dressed in expensive-looking athleisure like they'd just come back from the gym, both holding wine glasses with what looked like a very nice bottle of red on the coffee table, both laughing at something on a laptop screen in front of them. Sarah looked nothing like someone in the final stages of pancreatic cancer. She had color in her cheeks, she was sitting up straight, and her movements were fluid and energetic. And Chloe looked relaxed and happy in a way she hadn't looked when she was actually living at home with me and our son. I stood there watching them for maybe 30 seconds, my brain trying to process what I was seeing, trying to reconcile the scene with everything I'd been told over the past 7 weeks. And that's when I heard Sarah ask whether they should post the hospital photo now or save it for tomorrow. Chloe laughed and said they should space them out so people didn't get suspicious. Then they both started scrolling through photos on the laptop, making comments about which ones looked more authentic and which angles made Sarah look sicker. I pulled Leo back from the door and walked us quickly back to the car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. On the drive home, I felt like I was having some kind of out-of-body experience where nothing was real anymore. That night, after I'd put Leo to bed, I sat in the dark in our living room and forced myself to think through everything systematically, to look at all those small, weird signs I'd been ignoring and see them for what they actually were. The picture that emerged was so much worse than I'd wanted to believe. I grabbed my laptop and started going through Chloe's social media posts more carefully, screenshotting everything, checking the metadata on every photo. The more I looked, the more obvious it became that she'd been staging the whole thing. The next morning, I called a private investigator, one of those services you find online that feels sleazy just to Google. When I'd explained the situation to the guy on the phone, there'd been this long pause before he told me he'd seen cases like this before, and they never ended well for the person doing the lying. If I'm wrong, I'll live with that, I'd whispered to myself that night, staring at the investigator's contact information on my screen. But if I'm right, everything is about to burn. The investigator called me 3 days later, and the tone of his voice told me everything before he'd even started explaining what he'd found. He'd followed Chloe for 72 hours straight, documenting every movement, every location, every interaction. What he'd discovered was so much worse than I'd imagined. There were no hospital visits, no doctor appointments, no chemotherapy sessions, nothing that even remotely suggested there was a dying cancer patient in that house. Instead, he'd watched Chloe attend yoga classes at an upscale studio downtown, have 2-hour lunches with friends at expensive restaurants where they'd ordered multiple bottles of wine, go shopping at Nordstrom, Sephora, and Williams-Sonoma, spending money like someone on vacation rather than someone caring for a terminally ill parent. Sarah had been with her for most of these outings, looking perfectly healthy and energetic, laughing and chatting, and moving around with the kind of ease that nobody in stage 4 pancreatic cancer could possibly manage. The investigator had taken photos and videos of everything, time-stamped and geotagged, building an irrefutable timeline that completely contradicted every single thing Chloe had told me over the past 7 weeks. He'd even captured video of them at a wine bar on an afternoon when Chloe had texted me saying Sarah was having a particularly rough day and couldn't have visitors. In the video, they were both laughing and toasting with champagne. But then he told me something that made my stomach drop in a way that even the fake cancer revelation hadn't. Something that transformed this from a personal betrayal into an actual crime. He'd found a crowdfunding page that Chloe had created about 3 weeks into her supposed caregiving journey, titled, "Help Sarah Fight Stage 4 Cancer," with a long, emotional description about her mother's diagnosis and the devastating financial burden of treatment, and how any support would mean the world to their family during this impossible time. The page had photos of Sarah looking frail and weak, obviously staged specifically for this purpose with props and lighting that made her look genuinely sick. And it had raised $22,680 from over 300 donors. I'd sat there staring at my phone screen as he'd sent me the link, reading through comment after comment from friends, coworkers, distant relatives, and complete strangers who'd been moved enough by the story to donate money they probably couldn't afford to spare. The investigator's voice had gone hard when he told me this wasn't just about a lying spouse anymore. This was felony fraud, federal wire fraud specifically, and I needed to understand the seriousness of what my wife had done. He'd said the words slowly, making sure I understood that this was the kind of crime that came with prison time, not just fines or probation. I thanked him for his work, ended the call, and immediately started going through that crowdfunding page with a sick feeling growing in my chest. I recognized so many of the names. People from Chloe's office who'd donated $100 here, $50 there, neighbors who'd given what they could, even some of my own family members who'd contributed without mentioning it to me because they'd wanted to help during what they thought was a devastating time. Chloe's best friend had donated $500 with a comment about how Sarah was like a second mother to her and she'd do anything to help her fight this terrible disease. My son's teacher had given $75. A couple from our church had donated $200 with a note about keeping Sarah in their prayers. There were donations from people I'd never even heard of, strangers who'd been moved by the story and wanted to help. And every single one of them had been manipulated and stolen from. I'd called a lawyer that same afternoon, one who specialized in both divorce and fraud cases. When I'd walked into her office and laid out everything the investigator had found, she'd actually leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle before telling me this was one of the most clear-cut cases of charity fraud she'd encountered in her 15 years of practice. The lawyer had explained that what Chloe had done wasn't just morally wrong. It was multiple felonies, wire fraud and theft by deception at minimum, and possibly other charges depending on how deep this went. She'd asked me if I wanted to pursue criminal charges or just handle this through the divorce. I told her I needed time to think about it because pressing charges meant my son's mother could end up in federal prison. But then she pointed out something I hadn't fully considered: all those people who donated deserved to know they'd been scammed, deserved to get their money back if possible, and staying silent would make me complicit in the ongoing fraud. She'd advised me to gather every piece of evidence I could find, document everything meticulously, and be prepared for this to get very ugly, very fast once the truth came out. I'd left her office with a strategy that felt both necessary and terrifying. A plan to expose everything simultaneously, so Chloe couldn't control the narrative or destroy evidence once she knew I was onto her. The lawyer had also suggested I file for divorce immediately and start that process in parallel with the criminal investigation since these things could take months to resolve. That evening, I'd started building the case systematically, going through months of credit card statements and matching charges to Chloe's social media posts, finding dozens of instances where she'd claimed to be at the hospital on days when our card showed purchases at restaurants 30 miles away. I'd compiled all the investigators' photos and videos into a single folder, organized by date and location, creating an undeniable timeline of deception. I'd screenshotted every post Chloe had made about her caregiving journey, every comment people had left, every update about Sarah's supposed deteriorating condition. I'd downloaded the entire crowdfunding page, including the full list of donors and their comments, preserving everything before she had a chance to delete it. And then I'd done something that felt like crossing a line, but that I knew was necessary. I called Sarah's oncologist, the doctor whose name Chloe had mentioned several times in her posts as the one supposedly treating the cancer. The receptionist had initially refused to give me any information due to privacy laws. But when I'd explained that I was trying to verify a cancer diagnosis for legal purposes and could obtain a subpoena if necessary, she transferred me to the office manager, who'd been willing to at least confirm whether Sarah was currently a patient there. The office manager had put me on hold for several minutes. When she'd come back on the line, her voice had been carefully neutral as she told me that while she couldn't discuss specific medical details, she could confirm that Sarah had been a patient at their practice, but had been discharged over a year ago after treatment for a growth that turned out to be non-cancerous, and that according to their records, she had no current cancer diagnosis and was in fact considered completely healthy, with no follow-up appointments scheduled. I'd asked her if she'd be willing to provide that information in writing if I obtained a subpoena, and she'd said the office would comply with any legal requests for documentation. That phone call had been the final nail in the coffin of any lingering doubt I'd had, the absolute proof that this entire situation was a calculated fraud rather than some kind of misunderstanding or exaggeration. My wife hadn't just stretched the truth about a real medical situation. She and her mother had invented a terminal illness from complete scratch and used it to manipulate everyone around them for money and sympathy, and apparently just time away from real responsibilities. I'd spent the next 2 days preparing emails to everyone who needed to know the truth, drafting careful messages that included just enough evidence to be credible without overwhelming people with information. One email to the police department with the investigators' full report attached and a detailed timeline of the fraud. One to the crowdfunding platform's fraud department with documentation of the fake cancer claim and proof from the medical office. One to the 3 local news stations, because I knew this kind of story was exactly what they covered, feel-good donation campaigns that turn out to be scams. And one final email to all 300-plus donors, BCC'd so nobody's email would be exposed, explaining what I discovered and apologizing profusely for Chloe's actions and assuring them I'd cooperate fully with getting their money returned. I'd sat there staring at my computer screen with all 4 emails queued up and ready to send, my finger hovering over the mouse, knowing that once I clicked send, there would be no going back from what I was about to unleash. I thought about Leo, about how this would affect him, about whether I was doing the right thing by destroying his mother's life. But then I thought about all those people who'd been stolen from, people who'd given money out of genuine compassion and deserved justice. And then I thought about what kind of person I'd be if I let Chloe get away with this. What kind of example that would set for my son about accountability and consequences. I moved my cursor over that send button and whispered to the empty room, if I'm wrong, I'll live with that. But if I'm right, everything is about to burn. I clicked send on all 4 emails simultaneously, watched them disappear from my outbox, and felt this strange mix of relief and absolute terror wash over me because there was no taking any of it back now. Within 20 minutes, my phone started buzzing with responses from donors. Messages ranging from shock to anger to gratitude that I told them the truth. I turned off my notifications because I couldn't handle reading them all in real time. The police department had responded within an hour, saying they were opening an investigation and would need me to come in for a formal statement. The crowdfunding platform had frozen the account immediately and sent an automated message saying they'd begin their fraud review process and work on returning funds to donors. 2 of the 3 news stations had called me by that evening, asking if I'd be willing to do an on-camera interview. And I'd agreed because I wanted everyone to know exactly what Chloe had done. I wanted there to be no possibility of her spinning this into some kind of misunderstanding or playing the victim. The next morning, I'd packed up Leo and driven back to Sarah's house, the same house where this entire nightmare had started, because I wanted to confront Chloe face-to-face before she heard about the exposure from someone else. I wanted to see her reaction when she realized her entire scheme had collapsed. The front door was unlocked this time, and I could hear them inside having what sounded like a casual planning meeting, Chloe's voice saying something about how they needed to post another hospital update soon to keep the donations coming in, and maybe add some details about experimental treatments to justify asking for more money. I pushed the door open and walked straight into the living room where they were both sitting on that same couch with a laptop open between them, surrounded by shopping bags from their latest spree. The looks on their faces when they saw me standing there went from surprise to confusion to something like fear in the span of about 3 seconds. Chloe had started to say something, probably some excuse about how good it was to see me and asking why I hadn't called first. But I cut her off and asked her a simple question: how long had she been planning to keep this going? She tried to play dumb, asking me what I meant with this innocent expression that probably would have worked on me 7 weeks ago. But I pulled out my phone and started reading from the investigator's report, listing specific dates and locations and activities, watching her face go from confused to pale to absolutely white as she realized I knew everything. Sarah had actually tried to defend it at first, claiming they'd needed the money for other medical expenses and that the crowdfunding had just been a way to get help they legitimately needed for various health issues. But I told her I'd spoken to her oncologist and knew there was no cancer at all. Had never been any stage 4 diagnosis or any cancer whatsoever. And that's when they'd both gone completely silent. Chloe had finally asked me what I'd done, her voice shaking. And I told her the truth without any emotion, that I'd sent everything to the police, to the crowdfunding platform, to the news stations, and to every single person who donated money to her fake fundraiser. The color had drained from her face completely, and she'd actually stood up like she was going to run somewhere. But I told her there was nowhere to go, that the police were probably already on their way, and that she needed to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. She'd started crying then, saying she'd made a mistake and asking if we could just return the money quietly and make this all go away, promising she'd never do anything like this again if I'd just help her fix it. I'd almost laughed at the absurdity of thinking she could commit federal wire fraud involving hundreds of victims and just apologize her way out of it with a quiet refund. Her mother had started yelling at me then, calling me vindictive and cruel for destroying their lives over what she called a harmless scheme that hadn't really hurt anyone. And I pointed out that $22,000 stolen from hundreds of people who trusted them wasn't harmless. It was a serious felony, and they were both about to face the consequences of their choices. The police had arrived about 15 minutes later. Two officers who'd clearly been briefed on the situation because they'd walked in knowing exactly why they were there and what they were dealing with. They'd separated Chloe and Sarah, taking statements from each of them individually in different rooms. I'd watched through the doorway as Chloe tried to explain herself in a way that made her sound like the victim, claiming she'd been under so much stress and hadn't been thinking clearly and had never meant for things to go this far. The officers hadn't seemed impressed by that defense. And after about an hour of questioning, they told both women that they'd be hearing from detectives soon about formal charges and that they should expect this investigation to move forward quickly given the clear evidence. I'd taken Leo and left before the officers did, not wanting him to see any more of this than he already had. On the drive home, he'd asked me in this small voice why Mommy had been crying. I told him as gently as I could that Mommy had made some very bad choices and was going to have to face consequences, and that sometimes grown-ups do things that hurt other people even when they're supposed to know better. But that didn't mean he'd done anything wrong or that any of this was his fault. The local news had run the story that evening at 6 o'clock, leading with a headline about a local woman scamming hundreds of donors with a fake cancer diagnosis. They'd included Chloe's photo along with screenshots of the crowdfunding page and some of her social media posts. My phone had exploded with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, some supportive and some accusatory, asking how I could have not known what Chloe was doing and whether I'd been in on it, too. The investigation had moved quickly after that, with detectives interviewing dozens of donors and subpoenaing records from the crowdfunding platform and from the various stores and restaurants where Chloe had been spending money. Within 3 weeks, they'd built a case that included wire fraud, theft by deception, and charity fraud charges for both Chloe and Sarah. The prosecutor had told me it was one of the most clear-cut fraud cases she'd handled because the evidence was so overwhelming and the victims so numerous and sympathetic. Chloe had been fired from her job the day after the news story broke. From what I'd heard through mutual friends, she'd become completely socially isolated as people who trusted her realized they'd been manipulated and wanted nothing to do with her anymore. The trial had taken 4 months to get to court, and I'd attended every day of it with my lawyer, watching as the prosecution had laid out the timeline of the fraud in excruciating detail. They'd shown the jury photos of Chloe at expensive restaurants on days she'd posted about sleepless nights in the hospital. Credit card statements showing thousands of dollars in luxury purchases funded by the donated money. Testimony from Sarah's oncologist confirming there was no cancer diagnosis whatsoever. And statements from donors who'd given money they couldn't afford based on a story that was completely fabricated. Chloe's lawyer had tried to argue that this was just a case of exaggeration that had gotten out of hand, that she'd never intended to hurt anyone and had just been going through a difficult time and made some poor decisions. But the jury hadn't bought it for a second. They found both Chloe and Sarah guilty on all counts after deliberating for less than 3 hours. And the judge had sentenced Chloe to 12 years in federal prison and Sarah to 8 years, saying that their calculated deception and exploitation of people's compassion warranted significant punishment. I'd sat in that courtroom listening to the sentences being read and felt absolutely nothing, no satisfaction, no vindication, just this empty exhaustion and relief that it was finally over. My divorce had been finalized about 6 months after the criminal trial ended, the process dragging on because Chloe's legal situation had complicated everything. But eventually, the judge had granted me full custody of Leo and divided what little assets we had left after the legal fees and restitution payments. I'd started taking Leo to therapy immediately to help him process everything that had happened. The therapist had been helping him understand that his mother's choices weren't his fault, and that it was okay to feel confused or angry or sad about the whole situation. He'd asked me once during a quiet moment if I still loved his mom. And I told him the truth as carefully as I could, that I loved who I thought she was, but not who she really turned out to be. And that sometimes people aren't who we think they are. And that's not our failure. Chloe had tried to call me from prison a few months into her sentence. probably wanting to apologize or ask for something or maybe just hear a familiar voice, but I let it go to voicemail and then blocked the number without listening to the message because I had nothing left to say to her. For the first time in years, sitting in my living room with Leo asleep upstairs in his own bed and no more lies to uncover and no more evidence to gather, I felt something I hadn't felt since this whole nightmare started. I felt peace. What would you have done in my situation?